A word about Center for Internet Security. We're a nonprofit organization formed in 2000. Our focus is really best practices, primarily in trying to improve the state of security globally. We also happen to operate the Multi-State Information Sharing and Analysis Center. As we began to look at the issues surrounding elections, we thought that there was an area that we could contribute, and the product of the initial effort was a handbook for elections infrastructure security that you have before you. What I'd like to do maybe in terms of setting stage is to add a bit of context. I initially got involved in, back then it was computer security in 1974. And yes, I know I was a child prodigy, so it was a long time ago. What I would observe, though, is that not a lot has changed since then in terms of threats and in terms of vulnerabilities. The technologies have changed, but a lot of things haven't changed. What has been constant, though, has been the increasing impact and consequence and frequency of the attacks. And so many of you in the context of elections are very focused, perhaps, looking at the events of 2016. But to put it in context, if you think back, Heartland Payment Systems, 2008, 134 million credit cards, TJX, in 2006, 94 million credit cards. Target, RSA Security, where they lost primarily. Here's a security company that was hacked and lost a lot of their intellectual property. Adobe, eBay, Home Depot, Anthem, Uber, and then Deloitte just last year. Each of those very significant attacks. Now let me turn for a minute to those that are clearly state-sponsored. This is not new, state-sponsored activity in this arena. So Estonia in 2007. For many, this is the first cyber war. Stuxnet, put the shoe on a different foot, perhaps, and what happened in 2010 with Stuxnet. Sony Pictures, Office of Personnel Management. Those of us who have clearances are all of our information is out there somewhere, and it is available. Most recently, Equifax. Half of all U.S. citizens have their personally identifiable information, credit card, social security number, et cetera, that is out there. Elections are different, clearly. They're the bedrock of our democracy, and so yes, there is reason to be concerned about it. However, in the context of the threat, in the context of cyber events, from my perspective, we're actually doing quite well. Not to say that we're in the position to rest on our laurels, and I think what you're going to hear today from our panel is what we're doing, what they're doing primarily, to try to improve the state of security. So that's the context. So today, what we'll do is step through the panel, as I said, fairly quickly. I'll do a very quick introduction. So our first panelist and speaker will be Connie Lawson, who's the president of the National Association of Secretaries of State, and also the Indiana State Secretary of State. Second will be Robert Bob Kolaski, who is the acting deputy undersecretary for National Protection and Programs Directorate at the Department of Homeland Security. Third will be Amy Cohen. Amy is the executive director of the National Association of Secretaries of State. National Association of State Elections Directors. Thank you for, we're almost giving you a new role. And then finally it'll be Mike Garcia. Mike Garcia is with the Center for Internet Security, and he's the primary author of the handbook. So with that, let me turn to Connie for opening remarks.
Sure. I want to thank John. I want to thank the Center for Internet Security for helping us get the word out at how much progress has been made since that day in September when I actually learned that the FBI was notifying states that they should look for 2 IP addresses in our statewide voter registration system. So just so you know, in Indiana we did that. And so from January the 1st of 2016 until September of 2016, we actually looked at 15,500,000 logins into our systems. That's how busy the counties were. And if you think back at how excited folks were about the 2016 elections, we had candidates filing, we had candidates gathering signatures on petitions, all those things the county clerks had to deal with. Absentee ballots, voter registration, 15,500,000, and that wasn't even up to Election Day. So from that date forward, at least in Indiana, although we had always made security a priority, it became a hyper priority from that point. And I have to say thank you to the Center for Internet Security, DHS, EAC, and other partners that have helped bring the states along and educate us on how important this effort is. I think it's important to note that every state is different. We all have different systems. We all have different local officials running the elections. We all use different vendors that supply the voting equipment, the tabulation machines, and others. And it's also important to note that, as you know, the voting systems are not connected to the internet. They're not connected to one another. Neither are the tabulation machines. So what have we done? Well, I can only speak for the state of Indiana. However, I will say the partnership of the Government Coordinating Council and all of the communications and all the different election officials that there. I've certainly learned a lot about what other states have done, but I want to tell you what Indiana has done. First of all, I've been very fortunate. Our General Assembly has supported me with the dollars that I needed to modernize the system. So the first thing we did was we migrated our data from one vendor to another. Our system was never on the state system, and I think that was a good decision that was made in 2005. And so we migrated our data to a company where we thought we would have more personal attention, I guess I should say, and that it was also on the cloud. And then we actually saved money when we did that, but I think it's safer. We migrated our data. We made sure that our outward-facing websites and our electronic poll books are not working off the actual database. They're working on a mirror of the database. And so we felt that that was important. On our websites like indianavoters.com, we upgraded the CAPTCHA to make sure that we were using the most secure CAPTCHA possible. Indiana also became a pilot state with the EI-ISAC, and we now have installed, even though we have a private vendor who hosts our data, and it was a little more complicated, but we do have an Albert sensor on our statewide voter registration system. As a secretary, I have applied for my security clearance, and in fact I will be having a meeting with the FBI on the 22nd, I believe it is, and so those security clearances are moving along, and so I'm pleased about that. There's a number of other things that we have done. For an example, we ran a phishing campaign with our local counties, and we have some education and some work to do, but they were eager for it. And we also ran that phishing campaign within our own office so that we can make sure that folks are educated. We developed our own system on notifying counties about what alerts we may learn of. And our governor has set up a cybersecurity council, so we have myself chairing that council. We have local IT folks on that council, as well as county clerks and our election division experts as well. So we're working very hard in Indiana, and I think that we have done a lot. I will tell you that this election infrastructure security handbook is really a great tool. So I had my IT people go through it and look to see, what have we been doing for a number of years, what have we recently begun doing, and what are we planning to do. And I would say 99% of it we're on it. And so that's why I think it's such a great handbook for all states, because even though we're all different, it is a tool for us to use to see that we are doing the very best that we possibly can to secure our systems.
Okay, with that, why don't we turn to Bob?
Sure, thanks, John, and thanks, Secretary. Let me just augment Secretary Lawson's remarks and talk a little bit about the activities DHS has been taking. But I'll start with a sort of statement. We are so involved, the Department of Homeland Security, the U.S. government, are so involved in election security because starting in 2016, we really did assess that the threat of something happening to our elections was relatively high. We saw that in 2016. We have not seen a similar type of activity this year or last year, but we have not changed our threat judgment. That being said, that does not mean the risk to our election system has to be high. The risk to elections have to be high. And it's through documents such as this and steps such as what Secretary Lawson is taking in Indiana that we will reduce the risk, that we have reduced the risk, and that we will continue as a country reduce the risk of any threat having significant consequences to our elections. So I am pleased from a Department of Homeland Security perspective on the progress the collective election infrastructure, election operation community has made reducing the risk to our elections. And I think we have made real progress over the last year and a half. I have been closely involved with this work since the time that election infrastructure was designated as critical infrastructure. There was a lot of conversation whether that was a good or a bad thing. I will say from our perspective, it has been a good thing in that it has routinized the way we've communicated. It has allowed us to build stronger relationships with state and local election officials. It's routinized our communications. We are in regular conversation. It has then introduced processes that we use for those conversations, and it's also allowed us to reprioritize our resources within the Department of Homeland Security to support state and local owners and operators of the election infrastructure. We don't conduct elections, we don't do that. We support them with the things they need. So to do that, we use the process that Secretary Lawson referred to, a government coordinating council, which brings together representatives of the entirety of the state and local election community and the federal government that supports the election community. There are 27 members that represent secretaries of state, state election directors, local election officials. 24 of those are state and local representatives, and then there are 3, myself and the chair and vice chair of the Election Assistance Commission, representing the federal government. The first step we took on as a government coordinating council was really to improve our information sharing processes and protocols to enable that to happen. We are working through that. We started with making sure that we had processes in place should anything happen in one election system that DHS or elsewhere in the federal government were to find out about, the UMSPP was going to find out about. We'll get that information in the hands of the senior state election official. That's our first priority, to make sure that they have that information. The senior state election officials have been kind enough to agree that that information has to get transferred to other senior state election officials, has to get out to the community local election officials, because an attack or an incident on one system might be a sign that the same thing might be happening elsewhere. And so building that information sharing network is important. It takes sort of mechanical things like having the relationships and knowing who to call and knowing phone numbers. If there's classified information about threats we have to share, it takes putting security clearances in the hands of state and local, or giving security clearances to state and local election officials. We're working through that process. Developing more contextual products so that, hopefully we learn about threats before they happen, and so we're giving regular background briefs on threat information to state and local election officials as well. And then plus just process side, we're actually building using the multi-state ISAC, the Election Infrastructure Information Sharing Analysis Center, which now 36 states have signed up. We just endorsed it in February 15th. 36 states are participating. We have every reason to think all 50 states will be participating. We have 88 localities participating at this point. We're pumping those numbers up. So there's now real-time information sharing happening through that Election Infrastructure Information Sharing Analysis Center, which is great. So there's a lot of ways we might know that something is a threat or vulnerability to election systems. Having the ISAC working is going to help us get that information to the right people as quickly as possible. It's also then allowed us to prioritize technical information collectors, including the intrusion detection sensors, the Alberts that Secretary Lawson referred to. My understanding is by the end of the year we will have deployed 55 additional intrusion detection systems, working with the UMSPP through the Election Infrastructure ISAC. So we're going to have a richer information picture. The intelligence community is looking for information of whether a foreign adversary, whether Russia or someone else is looking to do something in our elections, our technical infrastructure out there. And so compared to 2016, the information environment is going to be much improved. We will see things quicker, and then the processes to do something about that information is much improved. And that's all happened on the back of meetings like this, relationships like this, building partnerships, having the structure to get everyone to start to build trust. I said, I think at the National Association of Secretaries of State's meeting last year in June, which was the first of my engagement on a panel with Secretary Lawson, and I said, we got to get to a point of trust, but it's okay that you can verify that we're capable of working with you before you trust us. So it's a reverse of the old Reagan statement, right? Verify, then trust. I think we verified that we're capable of working together, and I think we're getting to the point that we have trusted relationships, not just between the federal government, DHS, and state and local election officials, but across the community. We've brought the vendors in through a sector coordinating council. We're starting to bring them into our information sharing environment as well. So information's going to flow. That's going to help us make better risk management decisions. And should things happen, that will help us respond in a better way in support. And so I think we're in a good place, but we're going to be vigilant. We're going to continue to build off these relationships. And we're going to push ideas like what's in this handbook. But we're going to do that in the right context for how states and localities operate their elections. There's not a right way to operate election, but what is important is the way you operate your election. It's important that you build security into the processes there, and this gives you a flexible tool to build security. And so I appreciate the work of the Center on Internet Security, and I'm happy to be here. Thanks, John.
Good morning. I'm here representing the state election directors in all 50 states, DC, and the territories. And for those of you who don't actually know what an election director does, because it's sort of a behind-the-scenes position, they implement the policies and the procedures and the technologies that are used in states to run elections and work very closely with their local election officials to spread information. And a lot of what we've talked about on this panel so far has been all of the information sharing, and my members play a really important role in getting that to our local election officials, because while there's 50 states and some territories, there's between 8,000 and 10,000 local election officials who play a really important role in sort of the first line of defense for election security. Security has, as Secretary Lawson said, always been part of an election director's job and part of an election official's job, and contingency planning and planning for the worst case scenario. And since the critical infrastructure designation, we have more resources to do this kind of planning, to do this kind of preparation, and to get this kind of important information out. And through collaborations with DHS, which has been really valuable with Secretary Lawson and her organization, and experts like the Center for Internet Security, my members feel like they have access to the information that they need to ensure the security of elections. And all of them across the board are working at the local level to improve security and to learn from experts. And resources like the handbook are incredibly valuable. They give both very high level recommendations, but also really brass tacks recommendations that state and local election officials can use and understand, even if they're not necessarily the technical person in their office, for how to make security, to improve security. NASED members participate in all of the programs that were already discussed. The Government Coordinating Council, NASED has members on that. The EI-ISAC, many of my members are participating in that. But we also work closely with the Election Assistance Commission on things like the Technical Guidelines Development Committee to develop the next round of the voluntary voting systems guidelines, which is how we ensure that our voting systems are secure for the future. We work closely with NIST on that as well. And I know that my members were pleased to be included in the process of working on the handbook, because it's not just written for technical people who don't know anything about elections. There's actual applicable information in this resource for election officials, and similar with resources like the Belfer Center at the Kennedy School at Harvard. Election directors and at the state and at the local level were really actively involved in putting those together. And we continue to work with organizations like the EAC and others to make sure that everybody across the board has access to the information that they need. Because this is a constantly changing landscape. We can't do this once. We have to make sure that we're doing this on a regular basis. So thank you for the Center for Internet Security for including NASED in both the drafting of the handbook and for including us here. And I look forward to the conversation.
Okay, Amy, thanks. And I would, Amy is speaking on behalf of Bob Giles, who's the president of NASED. And for those that weren't in the meetings that we had, Bob Giles was not a shy participant, and he was the one that kept saying, if I can't understand it, then it's too technical and we need to change the language. So he was very helpful. Last but not least, let's Mike Garcia.
Thanks, John, and a good transition. I'm going to talk a little bit about the handbook itself, how CIS came to develop it, the motivation for it, and what it actually looks like. So over the course of the last year plus, we've seen a number of efforts popping up. And one of the risks we talk about in cybersecurity a lot is the fog of more. So we wanted to create something that wasn't just another effort. Now we went from not having enough perhaps on cybersecurity to having too much on cybersecurity, and elections directors and other officials and other stakeholders associated with elections don't know what to do with it. So we wanted to solve a problem where even with all of these efforts, what we didn't see was many that were technical, that really provided technical guidance to get something done. That was one issue. The second issue that we saw was that is a very common one across all industries with regards to cybersecurity, is that it was difficult for technical folks to communicate the importance of things to non-technical folks. And so we wanted to help solve that problem a little bit as well. This is common across industries. It's also common with the ongoing narrative involving elections. It's really hard to describe these technical things that are going on from a cybersecurity perspective in non-technical terms. We wanted to at least provide a little bit of a bridge to gap that. And so what that provided the motivation for us. One, we wanted to provide technical, practical guidance for how to reduce risk in election systems in IT. And a need to bridge this communications gap between technical and non-technical folks. And so this is a very collaborative effort, as everything that CIS does. So we wanted to pull together stakeholders at every level, federal, state, and local, as well as vendors, as well as nonprofits that have been working on this issue, and create something that was of value and immediate use and immediately practically applicable. So in the handbook, we really try to do three things. One, we provide an overview. What's the point of thinking about cybersecurity from a risk management perspective in elections? Straightforward. Lay that out. Two, describe what elections generally look like. Now, there are lots of different flavors of executing elections, and that's okay. We didn't want to come out and say, well, there's a right way to do this. There's a right permutation for how election systems should run, because we don't believe that that's the case. But whatever choices you make as far as how you're going to run your elections, you need to protect them properly. And so we wanted to provide a generalized architecture so that you could manage risk regardless of the specifics of how you implement and administer elections. Within there, we provide some descriptions of the different components that are associated with elections, and then the risks and threats that are associated with them. What we also do is we classify them from a technical perspective, basically in terms of whether it involves a network. Does it sit on a network, whether it's internet connected or not? Does it not sit on a network, but you transfer data to and from it via some sort of digital means, like shoving in a USB stick or something along those lines? Or is it neither of those things, but perhaps there are transmission risks associated with it, meaning no, the system itself isn't on a network, no, the system itself doesn't have storage pulled in and stuck in and taken out of it, but it does transmit data at some point for some purpose. And so taking those three things, we move into the technical portion of the document. It's really important to describe those three things and explain them, because those classes appear both in the non-technical portion of the document and the technical portion of the document. For us, that's really critical, because it's what creates that conduit between those that don't know the technical work and those that do. Within the technical piece of it, we have these 88 best practices. And so what it allows you to do if you are a technical person is to say, well, for this component, we need to take these measures. So you understand this component in a non-technical way. That's good. Here are the X number of technical things we need to do. We've already done this many of them. Next year, we'd like to do the following number of them. And these are the resources I need to get it done. So it can help prioritize. It can help understand where you are, first of all, in terms of mitigating risk, what is applicable and what isn't. It can help understand and set priorities for what still needs to get done, and can help you manage resources in order to get it done. And so these are really specific, detailed things. We've seen a lot of other work that's good work with regards to cybersecurity and elections, but they say, here are things everybody should be doing. That's not a bad thing to have. But it doesn't specifically, usually in those cases, it doesn't specifically describe, here are the things that actually are proven to mitigate risk because we've seen them elsewhere. And so the good news about this is that in most elections jurisdictions, we believe that the majority of these 88 best practices are already being conducted. And that's a good thing. It's important to know which risks you're already mitigating so you can prioritize those that you aren't. And so we want to make sure that we're understanding how that works, and and elections officials themselves can understand which risks they're addressing and which ones they need to address soonest, and which ones they need perhaps a lower priority. So the way we look at this in terms of prioritization is that we want to take some further steps beyond the handbook. First, we're working on creating a tool for self-assessment so that organizations come in and say, how are we doing against these 88 in a very concise way, something that can be completed by whoever is their technical individual, even if that's contracted staff, and can go to someone who perhaps is not technical and provide a report to say what we've gotten done and what we haven't. Within that self-assessment, we want it to be a precursor to an independent assessment. So what we want to be able to do within CIS is provide training to those that could provide independent assessment. It could be contracted assessment authorities. It could be someone like the National Guard. It could be within state IT organizations deciding that they want to do assessments of election systems. Any of those are viable. We don't want to be in the business of deciding who does the assessments. We want to be able to provide training so those assessments get done correctly. And then third, we've seen that there are many, especially smaller elections jurisdictions, that rely extremely heavily on contracted resources. Software and hardware, sure, but also for IT support services. And so we want to produce a procurement guide that's going to allow us, that will allow election organizations to make good choices when they're building their contracts. Some already are, but you could always have additional help doing that. And so essentially the way to think about that is taking the 88 best practices and turning them into contract clauses that, should they be applicable, an elections jurisdiction could put into their contracts to help manage those IT resources, whether they're, again, hardware, software, or support. So CIS really believes strongly in a collaborative approach, and one of the things that we really learned going through this, because we weren't election experts going on, we were coming as a cybersecurity technical side of it. I'll use a little analogy to close out. And so I've, in my life, been involved in a large number of foot races, usually running towards something, occasionally running from someone. But typically, even if you're doing well in that race, even if you're running what you believe to be a successful race, even if you are winning that race, when you see someone coming up on your shoulder, you pick up the pace. You find a way to do so. And I would compare that to the way that what I have learned about how elections have been run thus far. So we've seen that security efforts have been taken. There is a pretty good race being run. But we saw that in 2016, someone came up on our shoulder. And so we're kicking it up another notch. And this is a very simple way to look at it. It doesn't mean there was some, this is what we see. Things are in cybersecurity, that there constantly are efforts on systems all over the place in every industry. And when you notice something, it doesn't mean that something's necessarily been heavily problematic. It means that it's time to kick up to the next gear. And that's really what we've been seeing from those that are administering elections.
Okay, let's open the floor to questions. What here?
Yeah, I guess you do.
If I could, would you forgive me for asking a question first, because I know Mr. Koloski's going to lead. Thank you so much. That's very nice of you. This is a question from Bloomberg News. Today, DHS and the FBI issued an alert about Russian government cyber activity targeting energy and other critical infrastructure sectors. Does the DHS alert also cover security of election systems, especially in light of U.S. Treasury sanctions ordered today against Russian entities for meddling in the 2006 elections?
The alert we issued today and the attribution associated with the alert does not cover anything that relates directly to election systems. It is there was no new information about anything that happened in terms of threats to the elections in 2016 related to or going forward that were related to that alert. It is instead activity and attacks we saw on other critical infrastructure sectors. The sanctions are tied to the bad behavior related to elections, but it's all bad behavior we've talked about before.
Go ahead, sir.
This is a question for Secretary Lawson and Acting Deputy Undersecretary Klasky. I'm sorry, that's a mouthful, and I tend to stumble over these. having covered this space for a while now, it's sort of it's a pleasant surprise to have you both on sitting 2 chairs apart. It's been a tumultuous relationship, I think, between the states and not between the two of you. No, between. But between the organizations and especially between the states and DHS, are the states right now comfortable with the level of DHS involvement, and if not, where do we need to go from here?
Sure. Well, admittedly, the National Association of Secretaries and even myself, we were very reluctant when the critical infrastructure designation was made, but we were reluctant because we didn't understand what it meant and what could DHS do for us that they couldn't already do if that designation had not been made. And so what has happened, we have learned that I said this at the National Association of Secretaries meeting, and excuse me, Bob, if I say it again, but you know, it's we're getting along just as well as we can in any forced marriage, right? But what I have learned, and the secretaries all agree that even though we didn't originally agree with the designation of critical infrastructure, we need to be at the table, and we as election officials need to teach DHS how they can help us and how we can communicate. So we are members of the GCC, willing members of the GCC, because we need to be at the table. And I think that DHS has learned a lot from us, and we have learned a lot from them. And so I think that it's been a good working relationship.
Yeah, thanks, Connie. Connie and I have a good relationship because we're on the phone every couple weeks together in our leadership roles, but it has to go deeper than that. And, you know, in addition to the sort of national level stuff we've done, one of the things we've done in the department is we have staff around the country, and we've had senior folks around the country sit down in each state with the senior election officials and be a regular partner at that level. And we started to offer services. I've said before, the relationship gets better when a service we offer helps a state election official, helps a local election official make a decision to help them do their job. I mean, we can do all the talking we want. We can build that relationship. I'm a big believer in that. But when you're actually seeing value in the relationship, and I think what we have seen sort of at the state and local level in a lot of places is the value of the relationship, the value of the services has then augmented the relationship, because I think we've given tools, information to enhance the ability of a state official to go to their legislator and make an argument that I need to invest in election security, to give confidence that you know that they've got the information necessary to be doing their job. So I've enjoyed getting to know the community, but I also think, you know, we've started to be able to support them in things that are helpful to them.
Other questions?
Hey, Matt Leonard with Government Computer News. This is a question for Secretary Lawson and anyone else who might have any insight on it. Can you talk a little bit about what your intrusion detection system is connected to and what sorts of insight you guys have seen from having that implemented on your system?
Well, our Albert sensor has just recently been installed, and in fact, I think yesterday we had our first information, and actually it was something that we had done internally, and so it wasn't actually somebody trying to get in, but it is working. We're starting to get that conversation with UMSISAC. Is that what you wanted? Was that what you were talking about?
Yeah, so what sort of information is coming through that? What sort of insight are you getting from that system now that it's up and live?
Well, as I mentioned, we just got our first signal detected yesterday, and we realized that it was something that we ourselves had done internally. But I think that that information that UMSISAC receives could be a number of things, and I don't know if John or Michael want to talk about what kind of information we would get.
Yeah, so the Albert sensor has been mentioned a couple of times, is actually a derivative of the Einstein sensors that are used at the federal level. It's slightly different, but it's similar in many respects. The sensors are primarily, but not exclusively, intrusion detection, and they look for profiles. And so, as Secretary Lawson indicated yesterday, there was an event, a triggered event, out of the sensor in Indiana. And so there are profiles that we look for, and the sensor automatically then generates that. That comes back to our Security Operations Center, and we do analysis. And in many cases, we will automatically block things. In other cases, we'll do analysis on them. And as we continue to get new information, so for example, in 2016, as we got new information, that went into the sensors, and the sensors took additional measures to block other things from other sites. As Undersecretary Kolaski indicated, that what we're now in the process of doing is fielding sensors that will protect all aspects of the elections infrastructure, primarily the voter registration systems. We hope to have that done within the next couple of months. Other questions? Barb says we're out of time.